Good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. I'm David McCann with Happily.ai. We are an employee engagement product centered in Bangkok, Thailand. And I'm here today with Tom Heath, who is the co-founder of HI Recruitment.
Yeah.
Perfect. So Tom and I are going to talk today about COVID-19, the impact that it's made on the technology sector, but more specifically, the impact that it's made on the recruitment business and the human capital management business. So today's going to be a relatively short conversation, hopefully shorter than the one we did last week. That being said, let's kick this things off, and I'm going to ask Tom just to tell us a little bit about him and his business.
Yeah, thank you, David. It's nice to join you today. So, as you pointed out, I'm one of the co-founders for a small boutique recruitment company called HI Recruitment. We are quite new to the market. We founded the business in about January this year. So, interesting times for us, the same way as it is for many other startups. We're focused really on the sort of digital and the technology sectors. And myself and my co-founder have about 25 years of international recruitment experience before we founded HI Recruitment. So interesting times for us. I think we're feeling a lot of the pain that our clients are feeling as well. So we find ourselves in similar situations of really looking to try and innovate and adapt and look at how we can come through the current situation a lot stronger.
So there's a lot to unpack in what you just said and in this conversation. One question came to mind right away. So would you be the guy that would help one wayward British guy, American guy, or French guy make the move to tropical paradise? Would you be that guy?
We could certainly help, yeah. The past 3 years I've spent in Thailand. I've worked for some of the big, large global recruitment companies. So a large part of my time has been spent advising overseas candidates. And again, I've done that when I've worked in the Middle East, and I've recruited into North America, South America, all over the world. So a large part of what I've done is move people around the globe. But equally as well, a large part of that has been advising companies, on the market that they're moving to, the things that they need to instigate in order to be able to attract talent. I think my advice at the moment would be very much sit tight. I think everybody needs to stay put for now. I think the expat market, employment market here in Thailand has always been tricky. I think it's probably likely to remain very difficult, if not get a lot more difficult.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I've seen a few chat groups with people talking about how they would move here if they could, and I think for most people, I think it's fairly plain that moving between countries right now is probably off the table, at least for the foreseeable future. But that's as good a segue as I could have hoped for into what is happening in the industry that you occupy. So you're in the recruitment space. You work with, if I'm not wrong, lots of software businesses and sort of general technology-focused businesses. And being in that innovative space, recruitment businesses often will try different business models, maybe adopt different technologies. What has happened to the plans that you had pre-COVID? Do you find that there's going to be a requirement to make a significant change in your business model or your product roadmap?
I think the simple answer to that is yes, there will be change, and I think like many sectors, COVID-19 is speeding up that rate of change. Before the pandemic hit, I think there were already a lot of technological changes being impacted within the recruitment and the talent sector. We've not maybe seen that quite so much in emerging economies like Thailand. And for me, I still very much see it as an emerging market. But if you look at some of the more developed economies, then, certainly the advent of things like machine learning and AI have been playing a significant part in innovating the industry. And I certainly think COVID-19 is going to speed up that rate of change. I think for us, as HI Recruitment, we were looking at how we can innovate, before this situation impacted anyway. And again, being an early stage startup, we had a bit of a period of uncertainty about whether the models that we were looking to implement were actually still relevant. So we've been looking at how we can partner much more closely with companies. We've been looking at a variation of an RPO model, which is recruitment process outsourcing. And I think actually that model is probably likely to become a lot more relevant, especially for some of the mid-scale companies, as they look to rationalize their cost base, as they look to get more value for money. And implementing a different sort of pricing structure, a different pricing model, and much more of a close working partnership, I think will actually accelerate. And these are one of the things that I'm quite excited about. We were wary about whether the market is ready for this. At a time of great uncertainty, are companies willing to take another risk and try and work in a different way? And I think what's become evident over the past 2-3 weeks is that one of the positive impacts COVID-19 has had, if we can say it's had any at all, is the rate of change. The situation is forcing companies to adapt and accelerate and innovate much more quickly. So from our perspective, we're hoping that if we can implement these new innovative models, then, actually it should be quite interesting for the market.
I'd love to spend 20 more minutes unpacking the business.
So would I.
Shall we? I actually do want to ask a question about that, though, because we know that companies are trying so many different experiments right now to see what's going to work. Is it in a growth strategy? Are we going to pivot more towards a technology integration path? Are we going to look more at, for example, doing webinar for lead generation? How are we going to basically overcome this inability to travel, which was the bread and butter for many businesses, international growth strategies, particularly in the B2B space? But as you talk to HR leaders and business leaders across the country and across the region, has there been a change in the types of roles that are in demand? Have some become more so? Obviously, certain sectors have been hit pretty hard. But if we talk about the technology world specifically, are there roles today that are in more demand, less demand, easier to find, harder to find?
I think, again, there's probably two sides to that answer. And I think the first one is despite the impact, the negative impact on employment that COVID-19 has had and will continue to have for probably another 12 months, 2 years at least, the demand for tech skills, will remain pretty stable. I don't yet think we've seen the full impact, across the market. So I do expect, the demand for technology talent to not to drop, but certainly maybe to plateau a little bit. I think, if it's answering the question, I think what we're going to see is a shift in the type of employment that people are looking for rather than necessarily the skill sets. I think there will be an impact on skill sets, but I think, we're maybe a couple of months away from really seeing that. I think the shift we're already seeing is a move toward more flexible working. So we're already seeing a lot of companies, a lot of clients transitioning from full-time employment to contract-based employment or freelance-based employment. So much more aligned with the gig economy. And again, I actually think that's quite a positive for Thailand. The contract freelance market in Thailand has been traditionally quite far behind the rest of the world. So I think, again, that will accelerate the demand for freelancers and for contractors. And not just from a client side. Yes, being able to employ people on a freelance or contract basis gives flexibility to the employer, but I think employees are also beginning to realize the benefits of working on a freelance contract basis as well. as they've been exposed to the flexibility of working from home, of defining their own hours, of defining their work schedule, I think a lot of people are beginning to realise actually, this is actually pretty good. And again, it negates this situation where people are reliant on one employer. That they're not suddenly going to be made redundant. If they have a portfolio of projects of clients that they're working with, it gives them much more security and flexibility to operate how they see that they want to. So I think that's probably one of the bigger changes we'll see and already are seeing in the market at the moment.
So the way that you talk about it, Tom, it sounds almost like the balance of power, if I could say it that way, in employer-employee relationships is in fact pivoting a little bit. It sounds like the employee or the prospective employee will have more cards to play, if not better cards to play in the world moving forward. Is that wrong though?
I don't think it's wrong. I think that's what I would like to see. And I think it's relevant for certain sectors, for certain skill sets. The technology sector, if we're talking about high value skills, then certainly I would like to see employees, taking more control of their employment and how they operate. I think for traditional industries and other markets, that's very, very difficult. But fundamentally, yes, I'd like to see that. I certainly think in certain Western countries, I used to run desks of 200-300 contractors, and we would be working with professionals who'd never had a permanent job in their entire life, and that's how they liked it. I think there's still a process of education that needs to happen over here, which is, what you sacrifice for long-term stability is you get paid more money. And I think there's a lack of understanding from clients, from employers in Thailand about that's the payoff. If I'm going to employ somebody on a contract on a freelance basis, I have to pay them more because I'm not giving them the security of a permanent job. So I still think there's a process of education to go through for the market, but again, I can see that accelerating.
Okay, well that actually makes a lot of sense. So what we've kind of talked about now is potentially the emergence of more gig style economy in a market like a Thailand. Might take some time to build that way, but looks like it could be pivoting that way a little bit. But now we start talking about various different types of employees: part-time, full-time, casual, contract, freelance. And it begs the question for the embattled HR leader here who is struggling with standard challenges, employee turnover, and specifically one of the bigger cost centers, onboarding an employee. It can cost sometimes half of their salary to recruit and onboard and train and then place in a role and coach for a little bit. So in that space, what advice do you have? What needs to change in that recruitment and onboarding process for today's successful Thai HR manager to succeed? What do they have to do now?
It's a good question. Not sure one that's got a simple answer, to be honest, or a succinct answer. But I think a lot of the skills and processes and platforms and tools that the modern HR leader needs, they are adapting to rapidly now. If we're talking about a convergence of permanent employment and contract employment, then a lot of these remote onboarding tools, a lot of these remote interview and assessment platforms that companies are experimenting with now are going to remain very, very relevant. I think the main thing that people need to maintain after this situation has improved is that degree of flexibility, and I think previously that flexibility hasn't been there. So I think rather than a particular tool or a particular platform, I think it's very much the mindset of maintaining what we've learned from this situation about flexibility, about adaptability, and about accepting the pace of change. And I think if we can maintain those lessons that we've learned during this crisis, then the whole HR recruitment onboarding process becomes a lot simpler and a lot more efficient.
Well,
so I don't know if it really answers the question.
No, you did. And I'm actually glad you said it that way, because honestly, this is the transition that almost everybody makes who moves into the technology world. So I myself, for example, was a banker, and I worked with training programs, and I understood the how shall we say, the timeline of a project could be 12 to 18 months. And you'd have, fairly infrequent check-ins in comparison to how the technology world works through, say, like a platform like Agile. The reason that you have scrums, the reason that your teams are structured the way that they are, is because, as often as not, the technology partner, whether it's a product company or a services business in the technology world, we can't plan 6 months, 12 months, 18 months out. We can plan maybe a quarter out. We can have a product roadmap, but when we start talking about, getting the work done and being responsive to changes in a customer or into a macro environment like we're seeing today, we have to be comfortable with that uncertainty. We have to devise an experiment and say, you know what, we think this idea, that tool, this team, okay, let's run an experiment and see what happens. Let's start really small. That methodology has helped the software world succeed. And I think probably a failure of leadership in this space, and this isn't to tar and feather everybody with the same brush, but I feel like we maybe don't involve the HR team in the technology company nearly as much as we should in this kind of work philosophy.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. I think, companies are, one of the things that COVID-19 has taught, maybe larger scale organizations, is the value of strong HR leadership. It's the HR leaders that have been thrust, front and center over the past sort of 5-6 weeks in terms of, changing the focus of these businesses and really, getting them to a situation of implementing all of their BCPs and things like this. So, again, I hope, whether this will actually happen or not, but I hope that does, mean that companies start looking at their HR teams as much more of a strategic asset, and not just, the people who do the admin and the people who write the contracts, because, successful companies have strategic HR leadership, and strategic HR leadership is there to help us through these particular situations, but also, to absorb the lessons learned and what can we use to the benefit of the company moving forward. So yeah, hopefully that's one of the positives that comes out of this as well. Yeah. Anyway, I won't say any more than that just now.
Well, listen, I think you and I could talk about this for like a couple of hours.
Yes.
But out of respect to our viewers, maybe we should condense this. So I'll kind of close with a data point, and then we can talk maybe a little bit more around it. So a great deal of the work that Happily.ai does is we parse through the feedback that employees are having with each other. It's our bread and butter. We help ensure that managers and teams and individuals and leadership all kind of understand what each other are talking about on an ongoing basis. It's our real-time play. And we went with our people science team to dig into what have these stakeholders been saying over the past, let's say, 4 or 5 weeks. And 2 things stood out to me that I think are relevant for our conversation today. These are things that employees, the individual contributors, said that they really wanted and needed. And this might be useful for our HR leaders who are listening. They really wanted transparency on work from home policies. They just wanted to have one fewer uncertainty in life, if I can say it that way, one less uncertain thing. There's so much right now. What happens if I'm legitimately sick? What happens if I need to take a personal day because I got to take my kid to the hospital or whatever? These various policy pieces are just questions that employees have. And then it's less existential than you might have thought. At least when I first saw that data point, I thought, okay, well, that's a solvable thing that an HR head could solve today. The second and more interesting piece, I think, from a purely self-interested product company's perspective, is the second thing that employees said that they wanted tools to do their job effectively. What we know is that it takes time to establish a new habit. And as we begin to establish those new work from home habits, we begin to realize, ooh, maybe this workflow doesn't work as great that way. Maybe if I had a great tool like Happily, it would work better, for example. But that's from my perspective and just these 2 points. But you're there talking to people, trying to get them to, maybe identify that it's an appropriate time to make a career shift. Perhaps it's time for their services to be put to better use in another way, in another place. So I imagine you've had dozens, if not hundreds of conversations over the past month or so with people like this. What are they saying to you? What's happening to the talent market?
I think, again, it's early stages. And again, when we talk about the talent market, we're talking about a huge swathe of different skill sets and different, different individuals. I think if we're to narrow that down a little bit into the sort of technical and or technology and digital sectors, then we are already starting to see that shift. We are starting to see probably the start of the market in Thailand going from very much a candidate-driven market to a client-driven market, which basically means that, there will be more available talent on the market, which ultimately may mean that it will be the client who's driving the market, as opposed to the situation we've been in Thailand for the past multiple years is very much a candidate-driven market. It's the candidate who can set the salaries and things. So I think over the course of the next 3 months, that shift will take place. And I think we'll start to see, the salaries within the technical and digital sectors maybe start to plateau a little bit, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I think in terms of what candidates are looking for, and what's maybe sort of, making them consider a move at the moment. And again, it's probably sort of split. A lot of candidates, if they're in secure positions with large corporates, they're just kind of sitting there going, hey, look, I'm quite fine, thank you very much. I'm working with SCB or whoever it may be, and for the immediate future, I'm just going to sit here and stay in my very secure opportunity. For those individuals that are, perhaps forced to make a decision, then they're certainly looking at that security. Stability is becoming much more of a key concern. It was always a challenge getting individuals into startups in Thailand over the past 2-3 years anyway, and I think that's going to be exacerbated by the current situation, that people will be a lot more aware of the level of funding, of the level of stability. They'll take a lot more interest in the product that a company is creating, and therefore what's the viability, what's the validity of that company in the long term. And again, that potentially started with things like the failed IPOs of WeWorks and the Ubers and things like this. So I think that was already sort of filtering down from the investment community overall. I think for other sectors of the market, for other candidates, it's about, how do I maintain this level of flexibility that I've been given access to? I think things like work from home policies, remote working will become part of the benefits package for a company. Come and work with us, prove yourself, and you can work 2-3 days a week from home. We now have all the tools that enable us and facilitate us to do that. And that's certainly something that, candidates are becoming more aware of now, that I've been able to do this for 6 weeks. Why can I not continue? And I think, that will be something that clients need to look at. Employers need to seriously look at, how do we use what we've learned for the long term? And I think that will have an effect on, the traditional 9 to 5, Monday to Friday working week. It's something we've all been, accustomed to, and perhaps me and yourself, David, for a lot longer than other people. But why do we need to be tied down to this static working week? So again, I think, that flexibility will start to play a much more key part in the decision making for individuals as well.
Well, this has been fascinating. I can say probably 20 more minutes to recap what you just said, but I feel like I'm going to leave it at just this. It's going to continue to be tough for startups to find the talent that they need because of heightened risk concerns. However, there is some respite for them in that perhaps the salary expectations will plateau just because of how much additional talent might become available in the market. There's going to be a preference for safety and security, at least for the next maybe quarter, maybe a few months. But the expectations of people who are going to go work for these large corporates might very well be flexibility and work from home. And that might be a thing that's here to stay. And like you, Tom, if that is a thing that gets put into everybody's benefit packages, I think that'll be great for humans everywhere. We all work a bit too much. We were all a little bit too stressed out. Perhaps this could be a godsend in its own way. Very weird silver lining kind of way, but
yeah, I hope so. And as I say, I hope it's a sign that, the gig economy will become more prevalent, that people can actually start to take more control over these aspects of their lives. We spend so much time in the working environment. It would be nice to have that opportunity to be more, to have more control of that process. And, even if we look down at the Grab drivers and the Food Panda drivers and these guys have got a huge amount of flexibility available to them as well. So, it's not just relevant to the technology skill sets, the digital industries. It's something that I hope permeates through a lot of the different sectors.
Well, I'm with you. Lots to figure out in that way, though, my friend. Thank you so much. This has been David McCann with Tom Heath with HI Recruitment. Thank you so much.
Thanks, David.